History as it happens, September 21st, 2023. Chile's coup.
He said, if Allende should win the election in Chile, and then you have Castro in Cuba, what you will in effect have in Latin America is a red sandwich.
I told him in passing that we had made contacts with Mr. Kissinger's office and the White House, and that we were trying to tell them that if and when Allende was elected, which he was going to be, everybody knew, we would probably lose our company.
Less than 2 years later, Allende was dead, the presidential palace in ruins. So too was the economy.
You disregard the fact that Allende was elected by popular vote in a regular election, and Mr. Castro took over by force of arms. Isn't that a very big distinction if you're interested in democracy?
50 summers ago, Chile was delivered into the darkness of dictatorship. A military coup, welcomed but not directly instigated by the CIA, toppled the democratically elected Marxist president Salvadore Allende. General Augusto Pinochet would rule with an iron fist for the next 17 years. Chile today is in the midst of another constitutional crisis, as its politics remain divided by the wounds of 1973. That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I don't believe that it's possible to separate the CIA from this coup, and I don't know if I would agree with saying that this coup wouldn't have happened without the CIA. The CIA, following Nixon's orders in 1970, sent a clear and unambiguous message to the Chilean officer corps. We want you to take power and block an Allende government. We want you to stop this government, and we will back you if you do.
In the name of fighting communism, the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet killed more than 3,000 people. More than 1,100 of these disappeared victims are still missing. About 200,000 Chileans went into political exile, and another 28,000 opponents of the regime were tossed into prison and tortured. Yet today, as Chileans struggle to draft a new constitution, one that'll replace the current text that dates to the Pinochet dictatorship, even today about a third of the citizenry believe the coup that did away with Salvadore Allende in 1973 was justified because it saved Chile from Marxism. Incredibly, this same poll found that only 42% said the coup destroyed democracy. Well, Pinochet was no Democrat, but he did get something from Nixon and Kissinger that Allende never did receive, a warm embrace. And that was because the right-wing dictatorship reversed Allende's socialist program. From the moment he won a plurality in Chile's 1970 election, President Nixon wanted Allende out. In this Oval Office tape recording from June 1971, Nixon is heard railing at Allende's nationalization policies. Large U.S.-based multinational corporations had owned Chile's copper mines, and as Ariel Dorfman notes in the New York Review of Books, Allende had also nationalized the mining of minerals like nitrate and iron, as well as many banks and large factories. And ambitious agrarian reform had been handing over latifundios, large rural estates, to the peasants. By 1973, almost 60% of Chile's arable land had been expropriated. Anyway, here is Nixon talking with Kissinger about the problem in 1971.
Well, we're not going to do anything openly on it. We can do some things behind the scenes, but on expropriation, Bill was reflecting the whole state of personality. We sure as hell can do something about expropriation.
We sure as hell can do something about expropriation. Don't you agree, Henry? Should we just simply lie back and let them expropriate things around the world? Screw 'em, said Nixon.
There's going to be a constant erosion of our international position. We can say what we want about dollars, but in his period, people were just too afraid to tackle us.
They didn't monkey around the United States.
And one of the advantages the Soviets have is anyone who wants to play domestic politics with kicking around a superpower thinks 3 times before he tackles the Soviets. Because they hit back, and we don't.
Well, there are dozens of audio excerpts of Nixon venting about Chile, and the declassified documentary record about his administration's attempts to undermine Allende's government is enormous. Scholars such as Peter Kornblue have obtained thousands of pages of diplomatic exchanges and secret memos. Now, the CIA's role in all of this is still highly contested among historians. In Kissinger's own words in a phone call with Nixon, "We didn't do it, but we helped them." When he testified before the Church Committee in 1975, Kissinger denied the CIA was directly involved in toppling Allende, but he did defend covert operations that were designed to undermine his government.
All of the matters to which you refer have been developed by well-established procedures in the government that have been consistently tightened, approved by the President, and briefed to the appropriate committees. This doesn't make them right. I'm just trying to explain.
Makes it all the more appalling to me, Mr. Secretary. You said still at another point where the age-old antagonism between freedom and tyranny is concerned, we are not neutral. Well, I agree full-heartedly with these principles as you've enunciated them, but I am puzzled. We are now told, despite these words about the principles that distinguish us as a nation, that we not only interfered for the purpose of bringing down that government in an elaborate covert action policy by the CIA, but that we were justified in doing it, if I understood the President correctly, because the Russians do it. And indeed, because the Russians spend more money doing it than we do.
So it should go without saying why this anniversary, September 11th, actually, 1973, why it matters to Chileans. Why should it still matter to Americans? After all, the Cold War is long over, Pinochet is dead, and Chile is a democracy again, although the head of the right-wing opposition today is a Pinochet admirer. Well, we hear a lot these days about the importance of upholding the rules-based order. But maybe not enough about why people in the global South roll their eyes when they hear Americans lecture them about democracy and human rights. And as we've been talking about on the podcast a lot lately, what shapes history? Individual decision makers or larger impersonal structures? In other words, why was distant Chile so important to the United States? Was stopping communism there really so important to winning the Cold War? Or was it just a peripheral interest? There are criminals in this story, but there may also be structural criminality. James Lockhart is a historian of U.S. foreign relations and intelligence and the author of Chile, the CIA, and the Cold War. Kristian Gustafson is a historian at Brunel University, London, and the author of Hostile Intent, U.S. Covert Operations in Chile, 1964 to 1974. Kristian Gustafson, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
And James Lockhart, welcome.
Pleased to be here.
You know, this is one of those chapters in history where you might say the final page hasn't been written or the book is not closed yet. This is still very much a relevant issue or a current issue in Chile today. It's still highly contested what happened and who is responsible. But I wasn't aware of just how contentious this still is in Chilean politics today. Kristian, why don't I start with you? In Chile today, there are people who are not regretful about what happened in 1973.
For them, this fits into an internal struggle for the soul of the country. You have to keep in mind, Chile is a country, before the 1973 coup, had a democratic tradition that was deeper and longer than France's or most of Europe's democratic history. So we have this image in our head of South America as a place where governments come and go, where there's always a caudillo or a strongman. Chile doesn't fit that image. It was a very strongly constitutionalist country. So what was happening through the 50s, 60s, and 70s with the rise of leftist, both communist and socialist, which are different things if you're a Chilean at the time, communist and socialist and radical parties gaining power, ultimately leading to the election of Salvadore Allende, who was the head of a leftist front party, was fine in the context of things remaining within this democratic exchange that was very frequent in Chile, peaceful handovers of power. But when it looked to many Chileans like Salvador Allende's party was going to change the constitution from being the representative democracy that it was to a quote-unquote people's democracy, Russian-style, unicameral, highly presidential system, they felt that the democratic tradition of the country was being eroded or overthrown on their part. So for them, the coup that happens in 1973, which we most associate Pinochet, but which actually was not Pinochet's coup. Really, it was a middle-class coup that was led by both the Navy and the Air Force, and laterally the Army, of which Pinochet was the head. Anyway, this coup was, rather than overthrowing a government, was preserving what they felt was the constitutional norm of the country against a government that was very swiftly and very decisively wrecking their economy. If you travel there, it's like, I don't know, I kind of view it as, a country like Austria that's had a bit of a depression. It's a very modern, it's a very European country, and they have always been a trading country, and economically they've been the breadbasket for a lot of the rest of South America, and they saw their eroding economy as a disaster. So for them, the coup that overthrew Salvadore Allende was a thing to preserve the country, not to overturn things. So our impression is somewhat backwards to that of many Chileans.
Well, James, I'll let you jump in here, but that's interesting because I can see why maybe people at the time who opposed Allende would have believed that. But we now know from history that the Pinochet regime was terrible. It was anti-democratic. It was murderous.
Kristian and I are pretty much on the same page. I like to go back a little bit further. You'd start with the aftermath of the War of the Pacific, where Chile acquired these nitrate and mineral lands in the north of the country. And as it underwent industrialization in the 1890s, you have the emergence of a working class, of an organized working class that's reading Marx, that's by the 1920s in contact with the Comintern from the Soviet Union, the Communist International. And a part of them becomes militantly communist, aiming for a Russian-style revolution. And then you had a reaction against that by the landed classes, by middle classes. And you have lots of outbreaks of this conflict between a left and a right in Chile, starting with the dictatorship in the late 1920s. President Ibanez, who was a military officer, leading all the way into the conflicts that were exacerbated but not created by the Cuban Revolution after 1959. And so this is a conflict that goes pretty deep in Chile, as it goes in Brazil, and as it goes in many other parts of the world, especially throughout the Atlantic area. And so it came to a head. It came to a head by the 60s and 70s, and the result of this coup was kind of just the latest manifestation or iteration of a back and forth that had been going on for a century.
So maybe a good place to start here. We'll start in 1958. There's a three-way presidential race between Allende, who I should note had been running for president a lot. I think when he wins in 70, that was his fourth or fifth time.
Fourth, yeah.
So in 58, we have Allende, and then we have another candidate, Jorge Alessandri, who's on the right. He's been called an oligarchical candidate. And then you have the centrist or middle-class party, the Christian Democratic candidate, Eduardo Frei, F-R-E-I. So there's this three-way race, and Frei wins. And the timing here is important, Kristian, because, Allende almost wins. He almost is the first Marxist to win a democratic election. But then in the following year, we have armed revolution in Cuba, and then John Kennedy's election in 1960, where he takes a more subtle eye to South America and leftist movements there. That was a lot I just threw at you there, but why don't you unpack that a little bit, the context here, before we get to 1970 and 73.
So there is a organized working class in Chile. They are tied largely to the mining industries, copper and nitrates in a big way. Like many places, Chile in Latin America has a pretty strong landowning class, and increasingly the working class are feeling they're not getting the full run of things. Copper is so important to Chile's economy, yet the workers are not getting a lot out of this. They begin to organize very early in the 1930s, and Salvadore Allende, as a young man, is a political organizer. You can trace the strain of socialist/communist thinking in the labor class of Chile back to about the same time as it's happening in France and all these places in Europe. In fact, there's a lot of political roots in Chile that come from Europe. So the Christian Democrats as well are a European party, and the party in Chile has links to the Christian Democrats in Europe, who will eventually fund them against Salvador Allende. So the interesting thing about the 58 election is it starts to wake up the Americans, for the context of our story here, that there is a danger that Chile, this otherwise stable and resource important country with all this copper and all this nitrate.
Yeah, copper mines owned by major U.S. multinational corporations.
Exactly. So they are worried about the implications of this strategically for the United States. And they presume that there is a strong hand behind, a strong communist or Russian hand behind this, because they have been presuming that the Russians are behind everything like this. The interesting thing is, and I've written an article on this, is this is actually the same election which prompts the Russians that they can profit from being involved in Chile. So the 58 election starts to wake the outside world up to the fact that the internal politics of Chile are ripe for exploitation for political gain in the Cold War. So both the Soviet bloc and the Americans start to realize that Chile is politically important.
Yeah. So, James, the Kennedy administration decides not to back the oligarchs, and in the 1960s, they put a lot of money and time and resources into boosting the Christian Democrats, right? Through something called the Alliance for Progress.
Yeah, they were looking for what American presidents and administrations always spoke of as a third option in the global South as a whole, not just in Latin America. The real shift of official American interest in Latin America came for a combination of things. The first one was Vice President Richard Nixon's visits, which were disastrous. He was attacked by protesters. They threw food at him. They spit at him and his wife in 1958. And when they came back from that, the U.S. shifted from what had been a laissez-faire, hands-off position to a more active engagement with the region. They created an Inter-American Development Bank that would give public loans for development to the region for the first time. They'd resisted that since the end of the Second World War. And of course, the Cuban Revolution created a sense of urgency throughout the whole region and beyond, really. The Cuban Revolution influenced African affairs, Middle Eastern affairs. And so the U.S. moved in. This was the Kennedy administration, as you cite. The Alliance for Progress was designed to take the wind out of the sails of any revolutionary or guerrilla movement by beating them to the punch of developing, modernizing, democratizing, making more of a fair deal in the region that would create urban housing, medicine, a whole range of things that would take away the poor, the landless peasantry, a whole range of problems in the region, and kind of preempt the ability of revolutionaries to talk about a revolution.
Yeah.
And that was where this major attention from Alliance for Progress came in Chile and the rest of Latin America in the 60s.
And they got the result in the 64 election in Chile. The Christian Democrats won the election, right?
There's a lot to that happened on the ground in Chile that had nothing to do with anything external to them. There was a by-election in the region for a seat in the Senate in 64 in a place called Curicó. And the conservatives, the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party with the capital L and the capital C, had believed that they could go it alone and in their own coalition, they could win this election. And they lost. And this caused them in a panic to form a new coalition for the next presidential election with the Christian Democratic Party, which had been a party that was making a good showing, but on its own it wouldn't have had what it did. So the reason it won as many votes as it did was that the conservatives and the left came together in the one candidate fray. And when they did that, the Kennedy administration said, they've made our decision for us. They've just shown us who we're going to back. And then we did back Frey with, $3 million directly to his campaign and even more money in a spoiler campaign against Allende. There are a lot of ways to interpret that. The way that I see that, this is something that Chileans decided and Americans kind of helped tip the scales in the way that they were already going.
Interesting.
But I think Frey would have won the election one way or the other because of what happened in Korea.
Yeah, there's a big theme there, Martin, which is there is a presumption in the United States that they are responsible for all the things that went on in Chile. But I think what I would like to stress here is how much of what goes on in Chile is Chilean in origin, design, and energy.
Yeah, so let me ask, because Peter Kornblue, who's one of the top authorities on what happened in Chile during these years, has produced a mountain of documents, but you two have also used many, many documents in your own research. So let me ask now about this. The CIA did interfere in that election, did they not? So talk a little bit about what happened there and how much of a difference it made.
First of all, I'd like to point out that the CIA's ability to act in these places is relatively small. There are very few. CIA station, as they call it in Santiago, is relatively small. Now, there is a tendency to think of the CIA as take your pick, either incompetent or omnipotent. They're neither, they're people. And so the half a dozen people in the CIA station are being asked to influence the election. Their view is they have not a lot of ability to do that. They can put funding in, which would be the most useful thing. And the important thing from their point of view is that the funding go in such a way as to not show that the Americans were overtly funding elections.
It was a scare campaign, right? To scare the middle class about Allende's intentions?
Yeah, to a degree, a spoiling operation. So they weren't so keen to back anyone overtly. What they wanted to make sure was that Allende doesn't win. So there is fairly low-key seeding of propaganda into Chilean newspapers. El Mercurio is one of the oldest continuously operating newspapers in the world, El Mercurio, which should give you another idea about the healthiness of Chilean democracy. And they talk to the European versions of Christian Democrat parties to move money in to support Frey. And they do stuff like buy a Xerox machine, which is a newfangled thingy.
So, James, I think now is a good time to pause before we move the chronology up to 1970 when Allende finally wins the presidency, to talk about Allende's positions, his popularity, where he wanted to take the country. Because, for instance, nationalizing the copper mines was not just his idea. That was a popular idea in Chile. For reasons I already stated, they were owned by multinational corporations. So who was Salvadore Allende and what did he want to do?
Well, there are a couple things there. I'll talk about Allende, and we'll leave the issue of nationalizing copper for another question. Allende he's a medical doctor, highly politicized, emerged in this environment in the 20s and the 30s as a Marxist-Leninist. He's a committed Marxist-Leninist, ideologically speaking. However, he was with a group of people on the Chilean left who wanted a nationally independent line towards their objectives, which meant they didn't want to submit to the Comintern. The Chilean Communist Party was very loyal and almost subservient to the Soviet Communist Party in Moscow and the Comintern, that there were members of the Chilean left, Allende being one of the leading voices, who wanted something that would just be Chilean, not be beholden to any sort of foreign advice or money or the like. So they formed the Chilean Socialist Party, which is Marxist-Leninist, but just independent Chilean. That's what Allende stressed. Was this popular? It was. There's a major basis of the Chilean left, the working class, that derives from very unfair and harsh treatment as laborers. From the nitrate mines up to the present, there were problems with union representation. There were problems with just getting a fair deal. There were problems with people not being paid well. All the issues that we would see in any country dealing with industrialization. And so Allende was a leading voice for redressing this through what ended up being a path of peaceful revolution, which is following, I think it was Khrushchev, I don't have my notes on me, and it's been a while since I talked about this, who talked about there are some ways in some liberal democratic countries where the left could win power through parliamentary majorities and preempt the need for a violent revolution and use that power to legislate a revolution. And Allende became a leading voice for that in Chile as well, especially as we go into the 1960s and into the 1970 election.
I'd add something to this, which is he attracts not just the left, but sort of, you might call it the sort of poorer end of the middle class, in part because personally he's quite a dapper chap. He has a sailboat, he wears nice clothes, he likes nice things, and he doesn't sound to many when he speaks as a total firebrand. He sounds like a reasonable guy. And one of the things he always talks about is the via chilena, the Chilean way. As James pointed out, we're not just parroting the Soviet Union, we're doing it our way. One of the famous things that he says is it's communism in a Chilean way. It's con empanadas y vino tinto, with empanadas and red wine, i.e. we're calmer, we're not playing this big game. We're doing a Chilean thing for Chilean people. So I think that is part of the attraction, which brings more than just the hardcore left working class onto his message.
He brings a kind of style, a sense of style with him.
And he's running for president again in 1970, and he wins. Although he doesn't win with a majority, he wins with a plurality. And that's important in Chilean politics. Why don't you explain why that is?
Yeah, I'll start, and I'm sure James will jump in. So the way the democratic system there, it's called a don't electoral system, d'Hont, a particular kind of presidential system. So when there is not an outright majority, the selection of who is the president goes to the Senate. The precedent and the unwritten rule is that they will pick the person with the plurality. But that's not part of the written Chilean constitution. So that leaves a gap here for the story that will unfold, which is the Americans trying to convince, or thinking that they could convince, people in the Senate to choose a different candidate than Allende. James?
Yeah, there was like a 2-month gap between the election and then when Congress had
the inauguration.
Yes.
So
Yeah, and it was the Nixon administration's policy to block Allende. I mean, we have that in documents. But before we get to that, though, what puts Allende over the top? Because as mentioned, he had, and you've talked about his background and his positions and what was going on in Chile with regard to workers and the middle class. But he had run for president a lot. So what puts him over the top finally in 1970?
James?
I wouldn't see it as he was put over the top. That's not how I interpret it.
Okay.
Now, this is my personal interpretation.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, he only got a plurality, about a third of the vote, a plurality.
He got about 36%.
Yeah.
So, which meant, 64% voted against him. At least that's the way it can be interpreted. The coalition that was put together for Frey in 64 of the Christian Democrats and the liberals and conservatives fell apart because Frey governed in a way that did not take into account the interests of the liberals and conservatives. He felt that would have been a sellout to his program of modernization and democratization, that would have just been falling back on old oligarchical politics. And by the time they got into 66, 67, the liberals and conservatives broke away and said, we can do better than this. And they formed a new party called the National Party, and they ran alone. So that coalition that got Frey elected in 64 fell apart, and he was left with just the Christian Democrats, and that wasn't enough to win. What happened was the Chilean electorate split into a 3-way grouping. I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but the Christian Democrats came in third. The National Party came in a very close second. It's a 1% difference in the vote.
Yeah.
That reflects real Chilean political realities. About a third were with the conservatives and a third were with the left, and then a remaining less than third was with the Christian Democrats.
But the Congress overwhelmingly confirmed his victory. As I mentioned, it had to be confirmed or before the inauguration 2 months later. Maybe I'm not using the right word there. But they voted for him in overwhelming numbers because of what had happened in that interim of 2 months, right?
With Schneider.
Yes.
Schneider,
so why don't we talk about that a little bit here? And we can talk about, the culpability of Nixon and Kissinger and all this, and Peter Kornbluth's scholarship looking at the documents. If you believe his interpretation, Kissinger was, if not the puppet master here, has a great deal of responsibility in the plot to assassinate General Schneider, who did not want to go along with the coup.
Right. I'll kind of sketch out the rough things that happen.
Yeah, chronology is very important here. So, Allende wins, or he wins a plurality, not the majority. He needs to be confirmed by Congress, and immediately there are people who want to block him from having that happen.
Right. So there is an attempt which the CIA is asked to do. So quite right. Nixon is, in his Nixonian way, agitated about all this because the Americans, over the last decade or more, have invested billions in the Alliance for Progress into Chile, and they do view it as an important example for Latin America not to descend into this sort of leftist swamp that they fear. And they talk about fearing what they call the red sandwich, which is a piece of bread that is Cuba and a piece of bread that is Chile, holding in the rest of Latin America. Now, that's a very little bread and an awful lot of meat in the middle of that sandwich, but roll with the analogy. So they try two things, what the CIA will call track 1 and track 2. Track 1 is an attempt to subvert the Chilean Senate to vote for not Allende, to vote for Alessandri.
Yeah, and he was the chosen candidate of Anaconda and Kennecott, who were the two major multinational corporations that owned the copper mines. But go ahead.
Yeah,
but he's also the chosen candidate of 36% of Chilean voters.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, Allende's percentage vote hasn't really changed much in the 1970 from the 1964. It's within 1% or 2% of the same. So it's not a massive swing, is an important point to say. And as James has pointed out, just around a third of the vote. Anyway, so this track one to try and bribe senators fails quite quickly, simply because Chilean politics is not amenable to this kind of approach. Then this track two, which is hid from the ambassador, because normally covert operations are done with the full knowledge of the ambassador of that country, and that is to convince some bit of the army to keep Allende's election from happening. Now, what they realize quite quickly is that most of the serving generals in the army are not at all interested in this. They're very strongly constitutionalist, i.e. they want to guard the Constitution in its current form. So they keep going down the list of people till they settle on
Roberto Vio.
Who was retired? Vio was retired.
Yeah, Roberto Vio, yeah.
Well, he was retired, is correct. They retired him in 69. He was kind of kicked out.
Yeah, so he is found as a potential to get rid of the most constitutionalist person, who is the head of the Joint Chiefs, which is Schneider.
General Rene Schneider, yes. He does not want to go along with a coup.
This effort will ultimately result in what is meant to be a kidnapping, which turns quickly into Schneider's murder. What this does, actually, this murder is galvanizes almost everyone in the Chilean political atmosphere that they want nothing to do with extra constitutionalist means.
It backfires, essentially.
It backfires. Yeah. They all agree that it can only be Allende validated as the winner of the election and for inauguration. So that is the sort of undisputable set of facts. The question on culpability is another one. I'll let James have a go now.
James, who is responsible for the murder of General Rene Schneider?
Roberto Vio, the brigadier general that was cashiered out of the Chilean army after an attempted coup called the Tacnazo in 1969. When he was thrown out, there was all kinds of changes and raises and promotions and new commanders-in-chief appointed, and one of them was Rene Schneider as the new commander-in-chief of the army and his deputy, General Carlos Prats. They came in 1969 with the Chilean army badly politicized over all that was going on with the elections, with the rising Socialist Party. And they came in committed to restore the professionalization of the officer corps. And they were always hammering the point that politics aren't our business, stay out of it. After the election of 70, several of the generals, in a panic, asked Schneider, what are we going to do if Allende wins? Schneider said, if he wins, he wins. That's not our call. We're going to ensure that he takes office as he's supposed to. And Schneider said, one CIA informant had reported these words. He said, this is a problem that the civilians have created. And so this is a problem that the civilians are going to have to clean up. And the army is to stay out of it. And there was a lot of pressure underneath him that didn't like that. That centered around Camilo Venezuela, who was the commander of the garrison in Santiago, another brigadier general, and Roberto Vio, who had been cashiered earlier, as I said. The CIA, in desperation, now I got to point out, because we haven't mentioned it yet, the CIA was against getting involved in a coup in Chile. They thought an Allende victory did not threaten U.S. security interests. They thought a coup could not be stimulated there, that it just wasn't going to happen. It was a dead issue. So everybody focused on Vio. And Vio was like a 1 in a million shot. He's a retired general. He's not in command of any troops. What can he do? So he recruits these really amateur people. And one of them, I think, was a car salesman or a bus driver. And he kind of gets them into a group who are going to plan a kidnapping of Schneider. The first 2 or 3 attempts don't make it. They fall apart. Schneider takes a different car one day. They can't even follow him. Finally, they get him one morning, and in desperation, they try to get him out. Schneider was armed. He carried a weapon. He came out of his car shooting. They shot back. He died 3 days later. Yeah. That was not what they intended, but this was Keystone Cops kind of stuff. And the shock of the death of Schneider shocked Frey. He declared a state of emergency, and the whole country just came together and said, we're not going to go this way. And then they ratified Allende's victory.
So let me ask a follow-up there. You said the CIA on the ground in Santiago did not want to do a coup, and that is correct.
Henry Heckscher, that's right.
Yes.
It's not just the CIA, it's the whole country team. So the people that are involved, including DIA people, they all agree that there is no energy for a coup internally. And that actually, they all agree Roberto Vio is not the guy they want doing any of this or getting anywhere near power.
But Kornblue in his mountain of documents has established, in his view, that when the people in Santiago, the Americans there, reported back to headquarters, Langley, we would want to do this, they get orders back from Kissinger and the CIA. Richard Helms was the CIA director. No, you've got to go ahead and do this because we don't want Allende becoming the president of Chile. And they worked with these rogue generals to assassinate, or really to kidnap Schneider. He winds up being machine gunned down. James, you want to take that on?
The plan was to kidnap him and blame it on a Soviet or a communist plot, and then use that attack, that so-called attack, to justify the state of emergency where the army would take over. Brigadier General Camilo Valenzuela, who commanded the garrison in Santiago, his thinking was, if this rolled in this direction and he called the troops out and they declared military law in Santiago, at that last minute, then Schneider would fall in line and say, okay, for the good of the country, we have to go through with this. That was a dream, though. That's wishful thinking, because up until the very end, both Schneider and his deputy Prats said very unequivocally, no, we're not going to do that.
So where do you place Kissinger in all of this?
Kissinger, really, this is a Nixonian temper tantrum, number one.
Yeah.
It was Nixon himself who set all this in motion. Kissinger fell in line because he wanted to be Nixon's primary advisor in national security and foreign relations. And so he fell in line to kind of enforce it. Helms, as a commensurate bureaucrat who was not a covert operator, but an intelligence gatherer or a collector, just decided this is the president's order, so I'm going to do it, right? I've been given a direct order by the president. Kissinger in his memoirs says that Helms made a mistake in taking this Nixonian temper tantrum at face value, and he shouldn't have acted on it. The president was just angry. And Helms said, I was in front of the president's desk in the Oval Office. He gave me a direct order. What do you want me to do? So I carried it out.
This is really important. As American citizens today, as Chileans today, look back on this shameful chapter in history to try to ascertain, who's responsible for what.
I'll add here as well is the CIA station, as much as they're getting told, you have to go work with this guy, they are saying back really clearly, Roberto Vo is bad news. Nothing positive is going to come of this except blame on the United States. And it hardens the view in the CIA. As we get into Allende's actual presidency, it has firmed in the view of the Latin American desk at CIA that there is nothing that they can really do to overturn or to get the army to overturn Salvadore Allende. So they are stung personally by being made to move along with the Schneider assassination. They cut off communication with Vio's group several days before the attempt and try to tell him to stop. Alas, he's got his own dreams of power. But it firms within the CIA that they have to be very, very careful, or else what will result is just increased power for the communists who will play on American involvement to their favor.
And well, if we're supposed to support democracy, that means allowing other countries to determine their own internal affairs. But
I'm not going to speak for Kristian, but I think we have the same view on this. We've mentioned Peter Kornblue a couple of times. He works at the National Security Archive at GW, George Washington University. It's a think tank or an activist agency that gets documents of immense value to historians. I mean, they're always active in getting all kinds of documents and putting them out on all kinds of sources, and we're extremely thankful for them. But that doesn't mean that we agree with the interpretations that Kornblue has put forward. I think professionally, I find myself in complete disagreement with his assumptions. One of them being Chileans like Roberto Vio or Augusto Pinochet or Gustavo Ley or any number of others, Pepe Moreno, the admiral, they can't plan and coordinate and execute their own coup for their own reasons on their own schedule. Chile is not a third world country. It is very much like a European country. It's got sophisticated institutions and capabilities. And the idea that they couldn't have done any of these things unless there'd been American direction or guidance. There's a large number of Chileans who, that's deeply offensive to them. Even the ones who oppose the coup would say, come on, are you really saying that we couldn't tie our own shoes unless the CIA came here and told us to do that?
In the final analysis, this 1970 operation does not work, although Schneider is murdered, and it backfires and Allende becomes president. And then in, I believe, early November, there is a document here written by Kissinger, a memorandum for his boss, Richard Nixon, Dimension of the Problem. So he's not willing to just leave this alone. The election of Allende as president of Chile poses for us one of the most serious challenges ever faced in this hemisphere. Your decision, meaning you, Mr. President, as to what to do about it may be the most historic and difficult foreign affairs decision you'll have to make this year, for what happens in Chile over the next 6 to 12 months will have ramifications that'll go far beyond just U.S.-Chilean relations. What's he talking about there?
There's a major battle going on in interagency circles in the U.S., centered in the National Security Council under Kissinger's leadership, to define U.S. policy towards the Allende government. So they've moved from this, Nixon temper tantrum of let's block his election to we've accepted that it's a fact. And now what is our government's policy going to be towards his government? And you had voices in the Department of State and some in the CIA who said, even in the worst scenario, he does not pose a threat to U.S. interests in the hemisphere. So just deal with him, just have relations with him. There were others who said, oppose him and try to overthrow him. You had people from the military saying that, and some from an operations perspective saying that. You had Brazilians from the outside saying, we want to overthrow him, we want to run some operations on him, we want you to help us do that and show that you're going to contribute to the security of this hemisphere against a Marxist threat. And you had Kissinger, who made his play with this middle policy of let's be cool and correct on the surface, but in secret, let's do what we can to, Nixon said, it's a done deal. It's over. Chile is lost. He'd said those words, Chile is lost. It is going in the direction of Cuba. But maybe they'll have an election again in 76. And what can we do between now and 76 is keep Allende from consolidating his position, try to keep the party broken up or fragmented, try to split the communists from the socialists. We can try to keep the Christian Democrats and the other opposition alive, help fund their press. We can keep the heat on Allende. And if there's a coup in the meantime, we're going to not lose any sleep over that either. But we don't think we can do it, so we're backing off from that particular plan. That's what was going on with these conversations.
And I'll add, I actually took this document. I interviewed Henry Kissinger several years ago. I put this document to him and said, exactly that. What were you thinking when you wrote this memo? And part of his answer was, well, there were so many warring parties putting words into Nixon's ears, and his view was to try and restrain the worst instincts. He viewed his own job as keeping dangerous ideas from being seeded into Nixon's head outside of the control of the National Security Council and deliberative thought about what to do. So he didn't want Nixon to fly off the handle again. And this led to the cool and correct approach that James just mentioned, setting up so that they could try and preserve something of the democracy of Chile without overtly trying to act against Allende. Now, the thing I will add, which is stuff that we know now, which isn't often discussed in the American dialogue about this, is that the Cubans and the Russians were thick as thieves in Chile at the same time supporting Salvadore Allende. So you have to view this now as a Cold War battlefield.
I was just going to ask that. I was just going to ask that because a lot of people listening to this might be wondering, why is Chile so important to us all of a sudden?
It's important because it's a prosperous democracy in Latin America. It's not run by right-wing warlord caudillos, and it's not run by communists. And that was a rare form of government in Latin America at this time. So from the American point of view, it's worth preserving as an example that a prosperous country can be a democracy. Because it's raised its possibility as being this Cold War battlefield, they are seeing the Soviet bloc getting involved supporting Allende. So that is starting to fire some of the more hard wing of U.S. government about having to operate. This is now a communist thing going on here. It's being run out of Moscow. Now, it wasn't that, but we do know, for instance, in the 1970 election, the amount of money that Soviets moved in to Allende's party actually slightly outstrips by probably a few $1,000s the amount that the Russians moved into the Unidad Populares. We also know the number of people that the Cubans were putting into their embassy in Santiago to bolster and protect Salvador Allende. So as we go into 70-71, very quickly the presidential guard that Salvador Allende has is almost entirely Cuban. We see the KGB, his handler was a guy named Sevastolov Kuznetsov, going into the presidential palace very frequently, advising them. And we have, thanks to a few Chilean researchers of Russian descent, Fediova and Ulyanova, some of the Russian documents discussing their view of Salvador Allende. The general Russian view was actually Chile wasn't strategically, from a strategic military point of view, hugely important to them, but it offered a place to really sting the Americans. So the Russian and Cuban view, the Cubans were more extreme, so don't view them as a oneer. The Cubans wanted Salvador Allende to go hard on communism and to speed up his changes towards a communist single-party state, and continued to urge him to do so. The angel on Allende's other shoulder were the Russians saying, look, you're doing a great job. Keep doing what you're doing. We're stinging the Americans hard just by doing this. Don't go too fast, because if you go too fast, you will prompt the army towards a coup. Yeah. And that will undo the work you're doing, which is towards socialism and communism. So there are two other parties in here, which the American left exclude from this dialogue, I think, unfortunately, which is, this is a Cold War battleground. My colleague Tanya Harmer has made a really good point that we can't look at this as a place where the Americans were going in to try and do what they wanted, or even a place where the Soviets or the Cubans were going in to do what they wanted, but as a really vibrant political scene, which was pulling in the Russians on one side, the Americans on the other side, to help in domestic political struggles.
And I'll add one other point about Kissinger, and I'm no fan of his. However, I do think something some of his critics seem to forget is that he was working for someone. This was Nixon's idea, or his order, ultimately, to try to block Allende in 1970. It didn't work. But Kissinger was working for the president of the United States, whatever one thinks of,
Yeah, everything that Kissinger was involved in overseeing policy towards Chile originated with Nixon. None of it originated with Kissinger. Zero. And all of it was from Richard Nixon personally taking an interest in Chile, a deep interest in Chile.
Chile was a place where Nixon had personally been insulted as the vice president. So he took a very strong interest in it, and maybe perhaps a slightly vengeful one.
Nixon? Vengeful? No.
Kissinger once derisively called Chile a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. Yeah. He didn't view it as an important place, so he was doing things because the boss needed or wanted him to.
Well, my listeners are used to my meandering interview style by now. It takes about an hour to get to the main order of business, the actual coup in '73. But all this context is important to understand. I mean, that's why I have historians on here. I'll just add something here. Ariel Dorfman, who was an Allende ally back in the 1970s, wrote an article for the New York Review of Books defending Allende's presidency. He considers him to have been a committed Democrat, who, of course, was on the left. He said his cabinet was the first to include a peasant and an industrial worker as ministers. It had undertaken a series of reforms, the most impressive of which was the nationalization of the enormous copper mines until then owned by predatory U.S. corporations. It had also nationalized the mining of minerals like nitrate and iron, as well as many banks and large factories, a number of which were being administered by those who worked in them. Though some of these initiatives caused economic and financial disruptions, there had been a remarkable redistribution of income and services to the most underserved members of society. Dorfman believes it was the economic squeeze that outside powerful countries put on Chile that caused more damage than the internal reforms, ultimately leading to Chileans wanting to get rid of Allende.
Well, even Jonathan Haslam acknowledges bad incompetence from the Allende administration in economics, serious incompetence in handling the economy. There are a lot of ways to look at it. It sounds like Dorfman is interpreting this through the lens of dependency theory. Dependency theory stresses that there are outside forces responsible for the underdevelopment, for the impoverishment of countries like Chile, and it's all outside of the control of the people who live there. I suppose that's one way of thinking about the world, but that's not the only way. And there are more things going on than can be accounted for by something like dependency theory. Yeah. So I would disagree with Dorfman's characterization, especially that Salvador Allende was not a Democrat. He was a Marxist-Leninist using a democratic strategy to achieve his objectives. And the Soviets were not sure about him either. He was more in line with Castro than with the Soviets. And, there was a meeting one-on-one with Allende and Frey right at the time of the election and the transition. And Frey said something like, look, if it's just you, Salvador, if it's only you, I trust you. You would be fine as a president. But there are all these forces at play that are coming with you that make this a problem. And that was where this came from. There were people with Allende, Carlos Altamirano, who were these far left firebrands. And putting Allende in a position, I think I'm with those who say it's a bad idea to pigeonhole anybody. So I don't want to put any words on him that definitely make him this or that. He had some disagreements with Castro over methods, so he's not really the same as a Castroist. But fundamentally, his worldview, he's a Marxist-Leninist.
His political aim is to disenfranchise the property-owning classes in Chile and to make it a people's democracy, as he tries to do in 72 and 73, to disband the Senate, to have a unicameral government, which is effectively going to only elect communist governments. The other thing I'd add is, in terms of this idea that there was an American-led economic blockade, was if Allende was many things good, one of them was not a manager of an economy. He had, and admitted he had, very little understanding of macroeconomics. So Chile, which started in 1970 with one of the largest cash reserves of any country in Latin America, had by 1972 gone deeply into debt. They had ceased exporting, their trade balance had flipped. He had, in the space of about 18 months, thrashed the economy. He thrashed the economy entirely independently. There was enough money to continue to run that government as it was for years based on Chile's cash reserves, in part because of the nationalization of copper several years earlier. Their revenues had been quite robust. So I'm not railing against nationalization or anything like that. That had been a great economic boon for Chile, the nationalization of copper especially. But Allende wasted that money. Now, what happens then is when Allende goes looking for more money to debt finance the disaster that is his economy, the creditor groups all say, no, you've already nationalized all our holdings. You've already failed to repay debt. Why would we extend more
Interesting. Here's how Dorfman describes that. He says, over the following years, an international credit squeeze of both private and public funds strangled Chile. Efforts to renegotiate the foreign debt were hampered. Copper exports were stalled in reprisal for nationalization. Technological expertise was denied, and essential imports were prevented from reaching the country. In December of 72 at the UN General Assembly, Allende declared, before the conscience of the world, his country was being subjected to an invisible blockade from abroad that was meant to create chaos and foment a coup.
That's just not true.
Well, Dorfman is an Allende ally, a partisan for him. So
yeah,
there was a U.S. intent to harm the Allende government. And there are words from Nixon saying, I want to harm him. I want to bring him down. And if Nixon could participate in squeezing the economy, he wanted that too. But Nixon's words are not enough. You have to ask questions that Dorfman doesn't ask, like how effective was what Nixon was doing and what the U.S. was able to do. How effective was that of actually changing things on the ground? And how effective were trends and events that were already happening on the ground in their own right in Chile in making their own history? And you have some things, it's not Nixon's fault or Allende's fault. You have a lot of Chilean workers, some mining workers, who are getting in the spirit of this administration, and they're not working, they're not producing. They're going on strike. They're going out for protests. They're asking for a higher raise. And production is starting to slow down in the country as well. So there are a lot of problems here coalescing in the Allende government that, I think Kristian and I want to back off on blaming the Nixon administration for all these problems. But of course, the Nixon administration had, as Kristian titles his book, very hostile intentions towards Allende, openly done. But you have to ask, how effective can somebody be from Washington, D.C. in something that's happening, in the other side of the world?
Two things can be correct. We can have two thoughts in our head at the same time. The Nixon administration's position here was disgraceful, but what happened in Chile was largely the result of what Chileans did.
Yes. The thing I'd add is I don't think it's hugely surprising that any American government would act in this way.
This is the Cold War.
And it's the Cold War. And, you can't simultaneously be a communist president of a country and reject international capitalism and then go to international capital markets and expect them to bail you out. So when Salvador Allende goes to the credit markets and says, please, can I borrow more money? It doesn't take much of a whisper from the United States government to say, we're not going to underwrite any of this, for the rest of those markets to say no. And what is also interesting is there is very little support for Allende from the communist bloc. So he is expecting, as Western credit dries up, that he can go to the Soviet Union and to its allies and to get support, and very little of that is forthcoming. As things boil on and towards 1972, it's becoming clear to the Russians especially that Salvador Allende's probably put himself in a fairly tenuous situation. By 72, the middle classes, and this is an important point because the officer class of the Chilean military is largely drawn from the middle class. As Chile's economics, as their finances start to spiral down, things are starting to squeeze the middle class. And so there are a series of general strikes against the Allende, so coming from the middle classes, the shopkeepers, the professionals.
The truckers, the gremio, yeah.
The truckers. Now, this is one thing that the CIA does absolutely do, is they go in and try and support opposition to Allende. Now, it is important to sketch what they're trying to do here, which is their view is they want to sustain opposition. The CIA start 1971. They've been stung by the Schneider assassination. They feel a bit hard done by if you look at their documents. They are quite welcoming of the cool and correct approach that is promulgated from the Nixon government, i.e. we'll continue to work against Salvador Allende, but we're going to do it correctly. So we'll make it hard for Allende to exist, but we're not going to do any overt skullduggery. As you get into 72 and 73, there is starting to be a lot of opposition to Allende from that 60-some% of the population who didn't vote for him in the first instance. So there's a major trucker strike, there's general strikes. The middle class start to strike. There's eventually a women's strike called the March of the Pots and Pans, where middle class women go marching through Santiago, banging empty pots together to say, look what the Allende government has done. We all have empty pots. There's no food. They do stuff like going around to the houses of the senior officers in the armed forces and throwing chicken feed at the doorstep to indicate, look, you guys are a bunch of chickens. You're not acting.
And this is economic chaos in the country.
There's really bad economic chaos. They aren't getting loans from the people they've expropriated stuff from. And the CIA start to realize that there is valuable opposition here. So they have a couple interests they work towards. One is to keep the Christian Democrat Party alive. So they again go to, I believe it's the Italian and French Christian Democrats, and get some money moved through third-party means. And I should say, I don't believe these third parties have any idea that they're working for the CIA to move money to support the Christian Democrat Party. And I should say this money is no strings attached. It's just money to keep the Christian Democrat Party, which they believe to be that sort of third way, not oligarchical property owning and, not communist Democratic Party alive. They put money in to keep El Mercurio, the probably right-leaning newspaper, alive because it's the most effective voice against Salvador Allende. And Salvador Allende has been trying to shut down El Mercurio. The government buys all the newsprint manufacturing and then effectively uses that to blackmail the papers. So The Democratic press is starting to be squeezed, and the CIA moved to support that. But what they aren't actively doing is trying to foment a coup. They keep trying to run or recruit agents, I should say. So the CIA officers are trying to recruit agents in the military to try and get a sense of what the military is thinking. From their point of view, the job is to warn of a coup, to give the United States government warning if this starts to happen, but they're not actively trying to foment it.
Well, I'll talk about this from the Chilean military perspective. As I said earlier, they'd been politicized and destabilized as a professional officer corps since 69. It got a little bit worse in 70 with the death of Schneider. After Schneider died, his deputy general, Carlos Pratt, succeeded him as commander-in-chief. He was in a very unstable position because there were a lot of things going on. There was an education program where the Allende government tried to gain control over national education and introduced their own politicized program into the schools, creating huge opposition. There's a great Chilean film called Machuca, which illustrates this. Allende wanted to force a major $100 million Soviet arms deal into the Chilean armed forces. And everyone knows, including the Chilean officers, that if that is done, it's not just buying Soviet weapons, but it's bringing in Soviet advisors, trainers, committing to buying Soviet spare parts, and getting rid of that relationship that the Chilean army had with the US and others in the West. And a mutiny coalesced in a couple of different services. But by the time you get deep into the year 73, civil war-like conditions are starting to appear on the streets of Santiago and the protests and the fighting. And the officer corps is losing faith with the flag officers at the very top. And they're pushed out. And one of the ones that is doing the pushing is a Chilean admiral named Jose Pepe Merino, who's in command of the Chilean naval forces in Valparaiso, the most important naval base. The Air Force has a bad falling out, and there's a new commander of the Air Force named Gustavo Allende. The generals had been discredited as Allende had brought them all into his cabinet, late 71 and through 72, and made the generals political appointees in the cabinet. They were Ministry of Interior and other posts. And this discredited them badly in the eyes of their subordinates in the officer corps because they thought you shouldn't be involved in this president's government. And as they fell away and had to resign from the officer corps, new commanders replaced them, Merino and Ley, and Pinochet ultimately in the army. And they had no interest in collaborating with the Allende regime anymore. They saw collaboration with the Allende regime as professional suicide, that they would be kicked out of their position by their subordinates. And so there was a mutiny from below. And I'm talking about field grade officers, commanders and captains in the Navy saying, we're not following this anymore. Allende lost control over the armed forces.
I'll add one bit to that, which is part of the problem when the CIA tried to prevent Allende from being inaugurated in 70 was the constitutionalist nature of the officer corps, that we have signed our oath not to the president, but to the Constitution, as Chilean officers did. And now in 73, Allende is trying to change the Constitution. So they begin to believe they have their own legal justification to act against Allende, which is he is trying to dismantle the Constitution to which they have given their oath. So internally, they are seeing increasing justification to act against Allende. And the thing I would underline on this is the CIA isn't making them think like this. They are thinking like this within the body of political thought which runs Chile.
So we have economic chaos, we have a contentious politics with people on the right and on the left opposing Allende's policies, and we have the military, as James just described, discontent.
We've got to continue with that, just to get through with that with Merino, because it goes to the heart of the matter of where the plan for the coup came from.
Yes.
Who wrote that plan? At whose initiative? And it was Merino who had written earlier a plan in the service of Allende of what if there's an insurgency? What if there is some sort of a revolt in the country? How can the military be brought in a state of emergency, in a counterinsurgency role, and establish law and order in the cities? And so it was a plan for the military to take over on behalf of the government to restore law and order in the event of a civil war-like insurgency breaking out. And at the end of one meeting, this is in very late August of 1973, Merino, in anger, just goes back to his headquarters and pulls out the plan. It was Operation Cuchoyuyo, Operation Seaweed, and he just rewrites it. It's no longer an operation where the military will be a counterinsurgency force. It becomes an operation where the military is the insurgency, where it's a mutiny, and the Navy is going to take over. And Merino, in desperation, sends a note to Allende and Ley and says, look, we're moving on the 11th. We hope you'll join us, because if we don't move together as the armed forces, it's going to be the end of us and the end of Chile. And at the very last minute, Pinochet, who was reticent to get involved in any of this, got involved. As the events unfolded, the army being the most powerful armed force in Chile, he coalesced this into a power grab for himself and created that dictatorship. But this plan didn't come from the CIA. It didn't come from Brazil. It came from Chileans, from the office of Pepe Merino. And it was initiated by Chileans in a state of panic, feeling like if we don't move now, we're losing the country to chaos.
Here's the interesting thing. So the CIA is being asked from Washington, what's going on? What's going on? Everyone thinks there's going to be a coup. What's going on? The CIA, they have agents within the Chilean military. Interestingly, several of those are probably doubles, i.e. it's probably the case that some of the people that the CIA thought were agents within the Chilean military were actually people who had been pushed to go talk to the CIA to funnel information to them. The CIA itself determines, Latin American desk determines in August that there's probably going to be a coup. either it won't succeed and therefore CIA attachment to it would be a disaster for American politics, or it will succeed under its own steam, in which case American assistance is not needed. So their view is we are not going to say anything to anyone about what the United States thinks about this coup, which they don't. So reporting that you see the CIA writing back in the days leading up to the 11 September coup are quite interesting, because they're reporting on 8 September that they're pretty sure there's going to be a coup. It's going to be on the 10th, and perhaps even the army will participate. So underlining James' point that coup origination is not out of Pinochet's people, that people call it the Pinochet coup. It actually wasn't his coup. So he comes on quite late. He holds his cards very close to his chest. Several years ago, I spoke to someone who happened to be his young aide-de-camp, a young lieutenant at the time, who told me that actually Pinochet had been involved in the discussions with Merino earlier, but was keeping his own cards quite close to his chest in case the plot was penetrated. But from the CIA point of view, they couldn't get a read on what Pinochet was doing, but they knew that the Air Force and especially the Navy were moving towards a coup and felt it would probably succeed. They knew at least that the army was, quote, likely not to oppose the Navy's actions, was the words that they put down.
And I'm going over some of Kornblue's remarks in an interview he gave here about these critical days in late August and early September and the documents that he has dug up. He also says that this was a Chilean military coup. I think his argument is the CIA was responsible for helping create a climate for a coup prior to September of 73, for some of the reasons we discussed, information, misinformation, disinformation, planting newspaper stories, fomenting chaos. And
I would say,
I know you guys disagree with him, but I only bring him up because I don't have my own expertise on this.
As James has said earlier, that is a way of interpreting that information. I wouldn't characterize it as that. They were trying to sustain an opposition. They weren't telling that opposition what to think or what to do. They were trying to buy space for that opposition before any venue for the opposition to exist was shut down in as subtle a way as they possibly could. So largely by financial and quite modest financial support to certain opposition venues, principally a newspaper and principally some money into the trucker strikes. Would I characterize that as building the climate for it? No. The climate for the coup was, I believe, quite internal to Chile.
And the tragedy here, though, is, if your interpretation is correct that Allende was out to subvert Chilean democracy, well, Pinochet certainly didn't save democracy. We get a terrible, brutal dictatorship for, 15 years. I mean, this is a tragedy all around, wouldn't you say?
I've done a lot of thinking on this, Martin, and self-reflection. There was a great review of my book in the Journal of Latin American Studies by a scholar named Pablo Politzer. And he pointed out that
I have that in front of me right here. Go ahead.
You have his review of my book. Okay.
Yeah.
The review that he wrote, when I read it, my first thought was, this guy has some really good criticism. And I wish that I'd been able to talk with him before I published the book, because I could have incorporated his comments and made it a better book. And one of the things that he criticizes me for is not coming out strongly and saying whether the CIA was not involved in this coup, or whether this coup would have occurred without the CIA involvement. And the self-reflection I've done on this as well, and why didn't I say that? Because I've said it in many other events in the history of that book, from the 1890s up to 1970, because I don't believe that it's possible to separate the CIA from this coup. And I don't know if I would agree with saying that this coup wouldn't have happened without the CIA. The CIA, following Nixon's orders in 1970, sent a clear and unambiguous message to the Chilean officer corps: we want you to take power and block an Allende government. We want you to stop this government, and we will back you if you do. They never retracted that message. So can I measure the psychological effects of that message? I can't, but I think it gave them a sense of confidence. Merino, Pinochet, the others.
Yeah, the climate for a coup that I mentioned.
They will back us. Yeah, so I'm not 100% in disagreement with Kornblue on this one. I think that it's impossible to talk about this coup and say the CIA was disinvolved. I don't know what exactly their percentage of involvement would be. I don't think they were the deciding factors, but I don't think it would have happened in the way that it did, as it did, by the people who did it, if you take the CIA involvement away. This gets into counterfactuals, but
Yes.
So it's speculation. But that's where I come down on that now.
I don't think the CIA were a massive motive force. I think James and others are right that the US government made it clear that they weren't keen on a communist government, but I don't think that is a news flash to anyone in Chile or anywhere elsewhere in the middle of the Cold War. This is not the superpowers playing in Chile. It is Chileans trying to harness superpower issues to their own ends.
I think this is all important to discuss because, we're grappling right now with the legacy of the Cold War and the post-Cold War period because of what's going on in Eastern Europe. And, whatever we learn here, we can apply to other scenarios that we're thinking about these days. Individual decision-making in contingency in history versus larger historical forces, subterranean currents. The agency of the Chileans versus, the puppet masters in Langley, Virginia.
And Moscow.
And Moscow. That's right. So a July poll by the Center for Public Studies, that's July of this year, found 66% of respondents agreed with a statement that rather than worry about the rights of individuals, the country, meaning Chile, needs a firm government. That's more than double the 32% who agreed with the statement fewer than 4 years ago. And this is about the political turmoil in Chile today. The same article says polling shows more than a third of Chileans today justify the military takeover of a democratically elected government that went on to violate human rights, murder opponents, cancel elections, restrict the media, suppress labor unions, and disband political parties. And that would be the Pinochet regime. Final thoughts?
Chile is a fundamentally, and it has been since Diego Portales in the 1830s, it is a conservative country. It is a conservative, liberal democracy. That's the vast majority of Chilean views. They do not go for radical leftist views. You can get a definite, articulate minority who does, but about half to 2/3 come down and say no. And that was what happened with this latest movement to rewrite a new constitution. And they were moving in this direction of socialism, which gets some traction, but just not enough to make it. And in my final concluding thoughts, that's what happened to Allende. Yeah. He went against the majority tendency of Chile, which is a conservative country. It's not a leftist country.
That's right. Chile is having a constitutional crisis today. Go ahead, Kristian.
It is a country with a very deep history of democracy. It values that. It understands that. They're quite conscious of their political history. I agree with James's view that they lean conservative within a small c conservative kind of way, not in a way an American or a Brit or anyone else would understand it, but conservative within a sort of cultural political framework. Their political culture is their political culture. Chile is a distant enough place from its neighbors, even because of mountain ranges and deserts, that its political culture is really unique and really its own. Wherever they go, it's going to be their energy that takes them there, is the thing I'd finish on.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, goodbye Eastern Europe. No, I'm not saying farewell to anybody. That's the name of a new book by the journalist Jacob Mikanowski. And we're going to talk about it next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.